Okay, so now it is my job to introduce our next speaker, who again has, when I first saw him this morning, said, I understand that by showing up, I'm already ahead of the game. So, Professor Jordan Ellenberg is the John D. MacArthur Professor of Mathematics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research centers on number theory and algebraic geometry. And he'll be happy to answer any questions about that as well. He's a fellow of the American Mathematical Society and a Guggenheim Fellow, and he is the author of the novel The Grasshopper King, and I would highly recommend reading this, How Not to Be Wrong, The Power of Mathematical Thinking, which was a New York Times bestseller in 2014, and which, if you don't know, is a big deal, and the winner of the 2016 Euler Book Prize, which sounds like it's a big deal. And I will say, Jordan and I have had a debate for a while of who is the other Jordan. I insist that I am the other Jordan. He insists that he is. But after you hear him talk today, you will learn that he is in fact wrong, and I am the other Jordan. So without further ado, Professor Jordan Ellenberg.
Thanks so much. So, first of all, before I even start, it looks you can't hear me. Oh, I need to turn on the thing. First of all, I should say that nobody corrected Jordan's pronunciation of the mathematician Euler, so I know I'm not speaking to my usual crowd, where 10 people would have typed out Euler. Okay. Also, it looks like there's not a clock in this room visible to me, so I'm all the way to the back. Oh, so there is. Okay, forget it. I'll put my phone away. Okay, so I'm supposed to talk about math today, but let's start with a little Judaism, shall we? Let me start with little Maimonides. I want to tell sort of his version of the story of Abraham, like coming to adopt Judaism or monotheism. He says Maimonides tells a story like this. He says, after Abraham was weaned, while still an infant, his mind began to reflect. By day and by night, he was thinking and wondering, how is it possible that this celestial sphere should continuously be guiding the world and have no one to guide it and cause it to turn around? For it cannot be that it turns round of itself. His mind was busily working and reflecting until he had attained the way of truth, apprehended the correct line of thought, and knew that there is one God, that he guides the celestial sphere and created everything, and that among all that exists, there is no God besides him. Okay, so that's the story. The part of it I want to focus on is that, there are different kinds of revelation stories, and this is in some sense a very scientific one. Right? This is not a story about sort of a burning bush. This is not a story about an apparition. This is not a story about a direct experience. This is a story about Abraham coming to know God by means of his facility of reason and nothing else. And this is a thread that runs through the history of Judaism. It's certainly not the only way people encounter God in the history of Judaism, but it's something that I think is like very characteristic of this community, that this is one of the ways we perceive divinity. How do we build meaning into the world? It doesn't just happen. You got to think about it a little bit. You've got to use your scientific and reasoning faculties. And since one of the main tools of our reason is mathematics, I hope everyone's with me on that. It stands to reason that math would kind of get tied up with the attempts of people to perceive God and God's work over time. And basically, today I just want to tell one story about one kind of interesting development in the history of that thread. So I want to tell you what equidistant letter sequences are. Okay, so here's an example. Anything in math, somehow it's easier to give an example than to give a definition. So there are 12,196 letters in the Book of Esther, as you probably know. Here's another fact. Suppose you start with Aleph, which is the third letter in Bereshit, which is the first word of the Torah, as you know. You start with this Aleph, and you count forward 12,196 letters. Remember, that's the length of the Book of Esther. You count forward from this Aleph, and you get a Samech. You count forward another 12,196 letters, and you get a Taf. You count forward another 12,196 letters, and you get a resh. So Aleph, Samash, Taf, resh, Esther. So there is a long tradition of this kind of work in kind of in a certain kind of dare I say slightly fringy part of Jewish textual analysis. Rabbi Dov Weissmandel is one of the most famous proponents who was doing this in the 40s and 50s, but it actually goes back well before that. But as you can imagine, when this tradition encounters the age of computation, everything changes. We can do everything faster than we could before, including fringy Jewish text analysis. So I want to tell the story of a work done by 3 researchers in Israel, Doron Binstum, Eliyahu Rips, and Yoav Rosenberg. And they carried out the following experiment. They choose 32 notable rabbis from Avraham HaMalach to the Yabez, and they encoded the dates of their birth. Okay, and a date in Hebrew, as you know, can be expressed in letters. There's a number of letter correspondence. So we have sequences of letters, the names of the rabbis, and the dates of their birth. And for each rabbi's name, you go and see if you can find an equidistant letter sequence, just like the one I showed you for Esther, where you put a letter, you go a certain long distance, look at the next letter, you go the same distance, you go to the next letter. See if you can find those rabbis' names embedded somewhere in the Torah. It might seem at first kind of surprising that you can do that, but you got a lot of choices here, and the Torah is a pretty long document. Depending on exactly how you count it, there are 304,805 characters in the Torah. In modern parlance, that's 2,178 tweets, by the way. I checked that out. So you've really got a pretty good chance of being able to find these rabbis' names somewhere. And you also look for equidistant letter sequences spelling out these dates, the dates of the rabbi's birth. And the question that they asked is, are the rabbis' names close to their corresponding birth dates in the Torah? All right, that's a little vague the way they said it. Let me tell you about their experimental protocol, because it was quite clever, actually, although it's also sort of standard in this kind of thing. The first thing they did was found each rabbi's name, found their corresponding date, and measured, on average, how close in the Torah was the beginning of the rabbi's name to the beginning of the place where their date was found. Then, they did the same thing, but now they scrambled the dates at random, so that they were just permuted randomly. Did each one date match up with some random rabbi, not the one that was their actual date of birth. And they did this 1,000,000 times. So if there was no relation in the location of the Torah between the name of the rabbi and the date of their birth, you would expect every one of those 1,000,000 trials to have about the same results in terms of how close was the name of the rabbi to the name to the corresponding date. But this is not, in fact, what they found. They found that the actual association of names to birth dates ended up very near the top of the rankings. It was it had the 453rd best score out of the 1,000,000 trials. So that's quite a striking result. In other words, with the usual rules of statistical inference, that would lead you to conclude that something put the names and the dates close together in a text which was in its final form, I'll remind you, hundreds of years before any of these rabbis were born. Okay. So this study that they did was published in a journal called Statistical Science, like a major statistics journal in the early 90s. It came with the following unusual preface from the editor of the journal, which I'll read to you. Our referees were baffled. Their prior beliefs made them think the book of Genesis could not possibly contain meaningful references to modern-day individuals, yet when the authors carried out additional analyses and checks, the effect persisted. The paper is thus offered to statistical science readers as a challenging puzzle. Okay, that's not the usual thing you put before an academic paper, but this was not an ordinary academic paper. Well, this did not stay an academic puzzle for very long. What happened was an enterprising journalist named Michael Drosnin found out about this, and he really went to town. And I got to tell you, Drosnin did not quite have the same attention to the usual statistical protocol as did Rips and his co-authors. He didn't really do sort of formal experiments. He just went looking using his computer for any kind of prediction that he could find from equidistant letter sequences in the Torah. And he wrote a book called The Bible Code, which is a massive bestseller. He predicted all kinds of things. He predicted the assassination of Rabin. He predicted a comet hitting Jupiter. I want to emphasize those things that had already happened when Drozen wrote. He mostly predicted things that had already happened. There's an old saying that prediction is very hard, especially about the future. He did predict the end of the world in 2006, so we did sort of dodge that bullet there, apparently. But this was very popular. He went on Oprah Winfrey, he went on CNN, he met with world leaders. I mean, this was kind of a big deal. So there's two questions I think we should talk about here that are kind of separate. One, is this good math or not? And two, is this good Judaism or not? I think those two are both interesting questions, and they're kind of interrelated. And actually, I think where they really intersected, if I can sort of recall my own personal experience, was in the community of Orthodox Jewish mathematicians, of whom Eliyahu Ribs was one. This whole business was extremely controversial, and people were extremely split. I almost feel like I sort of want to. Is this weird? I sort of want to ask for audience participation. Can you guess like what people's response would be? Like, let's say there's a rather large community of quite religious, observant Jewish mathematicians.
They were positive toward that.
Because of gematria. I know the guys who worked on the responsive project. I don't know if they were.
Okay, good. So we're sort of reenacting the controversy that took place. So in fact, there was actually quite a divergence of opinions. I think there were people in that community who saw this as very much a continuation of a tradition that already existed and sort of had some reality within Judaism. And there were people, who, to put it, not to put too fine a point on it, who thought it made the Orthodox look like fools and thought it should be opposed. And actually, I was a grad student at Harvard at the time, and actually there were representatives of both groups there on the faculty, so it was quite tense. David Kajdan, who was sort of written an introduction to their book about this stuff, and was generally a supporter. His colleague Shlomo Sternberg, our Varder, was sort of on the opposite side. Sternberg actually wrote an article about this in the Notices of the American Math Society, where he called the paper a hoax and said that Kajdan, quote, has not only brought shame on himself, he has disgraced mathematics. So it was kind of tense at afternoon tea for a few days after that came out. I'll tell you one story I really like about this that I heard from Barry Simon, who is another Orthodox mathematician at Caltech and a pretty fervent opponent of the Bible codes. He told the story of somebody he knew who had a long Purim dinner with his rabbi, and there was a young man who was pretty into the Bible codes. His rabbi was not so sure. They were sort of sitting and having dinner and drinking, and the rabbi says, "So, tell me, what would you do if you found a code in the Torah that said that actually Shabbat is on Sunday, not Saturday?" And the guy said, "Well, how could there be such a code? Because Shabbat is on Saturday, not on Sunday." And I was, "Yeah, but what if you found a code that said Shabbat is on Sunday, not on Saturday?" But there wouldn't be such a code because Shabbat is on Saturday, it's not on Sunday. We know that. "Yeah, but what if you were in your computer for a long time and you found that?" And they go back and forth, and finally the young man says, "Well, look, I guess if I ran the computer for a long time and I found the code and I did all the statistical checks and I was quite sure that it was not by chance, that it was a real message that was encoded there in the text of the Torah, I guess I would have to think about it." And the rabbi said, "Aha! Forbidden!" So this is one point of view, right? That if we believe in our faculty of reason, but if there's some possibility that it would lead you to go against what you know to be the law, then, okay, forbidden. It's not kosher. Okay, so this was one point of view. So that's I think. Look, I'm not going to stand here as a Jewish scholar and tell you what's good Judaism and what's not. That's the point of view. I can, however, tell you why in the end this was found not to be good mathematics, and that's what I want to tell you about. That's what I want to tell you about now. So what's going on here? What's the problem with this argument that really did sort of meet like the usual criteria of statistical significance? Well, it has to do with something called wiggle room. It's not a technical term. It's a term I'm going to use to describe it. The point is, But these rabbis have lots of names. So for instance, one of their rabbis, it's an 18th century Hasidic mystic, named Rabbi Abraham ben Dov Ber Friedman. In their trials, they use sometimes the name Rabbi Abraham for him, sometimes Hamalach. But you could also call him Rabbi Abraham Hamalach, which is another name he went by sometimes. You could also use his full name, Rabbi Abraham ben Dov Ber Friedman. And indeed, everybody has multiple appellations, multiple names by which we can be called, and you have a choice which one to use. If you were trying to find the name of Dwayne the Rock Johnson somewhere in the Torah, you could call him Dwayne Johnson, you could call him The Rock, you could call him Dwayne the Rock Johnson, DTR Johnson. You have lots of choices of which version of the name to use. And it turns out that changing those choices leads to drastic changes in the quality of the results. So two of the people who really worked hard on this were an Australian mathematician named Brendan McKay and an Israeli mathematician named Dror Barnatan. I don't know if these are your buddies who worked on this. There were several people, but these two were two of the people who jumped right in on this. Dror is kind of a secular Israeli, so you can already imagine the sort of exciting cultural conflict that takes place between these two groups of people. So they did an experiment where they made different choices about which name to use for each rabbi. And their choices, they sort of checked this with biblical scholars, and their choices were found to make just as much sense as the choices made by Ripps and his collaborators. One rabbi called the two lists of names equally appalling, so I guess that's... And they found that with their list of names, something quite startling transpired. With their list, with the choices they made using their wiggle room, the Torah no longer seemed to detect the birth and death of these 32 rabbinic notables. But the Hebrew edition of War and Peace did. Actually predicting the births and deaths of those rabbis about as well as the Torah did in the original Ripps paper. So what can this mean? It does not mean that Leo Tolstoy composed this novel with the names and birthdays of rabbis hidden in it, designed to be uncovered only once modern Hebrew was invented and his novel was translated into that. That's not the explanation. No, what happened is that Mackay and Barton sort of cooked this. They looked at the text of War and Peace and made their choices so as to match War and Peace as well as possible. So when you have all these different choices for what to call each rabbi, it's kind of like a game where you have multiple chances to win. And the way combinatorics works is that if you have even only a few chances for each of these, only a few choices for each of this rabbi, gives you a huge number of choices overall for your set of names. So given enough chances, finding codes is pretty easy. And it's actually especially easy if you're like Michael Drosnin and you don't care about sort of fealty to experimental protocol at all, and you just go fishing. In fact, Drosnin famously said, when my critics find a message about the assassination of a prime minister encrypted in Moby Dick, I'll believe them. So sounds like a challenge, right? So the guy quickly found equidistant letter sequences in Moby Dick, referring to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Indira Gandhi, Leon Trotsky, and also Drosnin himself. He's still alive, though. And he's still writing those books, by the way. I think the last book came out in 2010, but he made a little industry out of it. So this issue that we're talking about, the issue of wiggle room, I want to emphasize that it is not, it's not just about biblical interpretation, although that's like a very vivid way in which it gained a lot of publicity. Let me tell another story to which this is related, and it's a story popular in financial circles called the Baltimore Stockbroker. Okay, so ready? Here's the story. You're sitting at home, and you get a letter from somebody you don't know saying, "Hey, I want you to sign up for my newsletter. A guy in Baltimore says I have these great stock tips for you. This stock, look at this stock. And just if you don't believe me, look, it's going to go up next week." So maybe for some reason you keep this thing around. The next week you look at the financial page, or you look at the app on your phone, and you see that, okay, so that stock, you said it's going to go up. Did go up. And just as you're noticing that, another letter comes in the mail and has another tip. And it says, okay, this stock See how well I did last week? Well, this other stock, this is going to go down next week. Watch and see if I'm right. And you sort of wait and you look. And indeed, the stock that the Baltimore stockbroker said was going to go down does go down. And just as you notice that, you get another letter. And so on, right? And this persists. And 10 weeks in a row, you get a letter with a tip. And 10 weeks in a row, this tip is correct. And now you're quite impressed, right? Now you're ready to entrust your life savings to the Baltimore stockbroker. What's the part that you don't know of this story? Because it is quite compelling. I think any normal person would feel quite swayed by this. What you don't know is that you are not the only person who got a letter that first week. In fact, the Baltimore stockbroker wrote 1,000 of those letters. And here's what's crucial. Those 1,000 letters were not all the same. 500 of them said this stock is going to go up. 500 of them said that same stock was going to go down. Now, what happens to the people who got the incorrect prediction in the mail that that stock was going to go down? They are off the mailing list. They are never going to hear from the Baltimore stockbroker again. The next week, he's only sending out 500 letters to the people who got the correct prediction the first time. But those 500 letters are not all the same. 250 of them say one thing, 250 say the other. Okay, those of you who are good at arithmetic now know that I really mean 256, not 250, so I can keep on dividing, but we can round. So each week, he's sending out fewer and fewer letters because each week there are fewer people who are convinced that the Baltimore stockbroker can do no wrong, until you, at the end of the process, are the lucky, or in some respects, unlucky, person who was the unique person who got 10 correct stock picks in a row. And of course, in the modern era of email, I mean, this is sort of an old-style stock market scam, but now you wouldn't send 1,000, right? You would sort of send 1,000,000. So you would have 1,000 people on the hook at the end of the process instead of one. So, in some sense, the principle of the Baltimore stockbroker con is very much wiggle room. It's the same as what happened in the Bible codes, that the Baltimore stockbroker has lots of choices which you may not see. You don't see all the sort of failed roads that he went down. You only see the sort of successful road that you witnessed. Now, one of the interesting things about this story is it's an evergreen story in financial circles, but I did kind of research this for the book, and it's not clear that this scam in the form I just outlined was ever literally carried out. I really did try to find an example. It's something everybody talks about, this other principle. It's not clear it actually happened as such. But in some sense, there's things that are a lot like it that do happen. I'll give you an example. When a mutual fund company is developing mutual funds, they have what's called an incubation period. What that means is that they try a lot of funds with a lot of different strategies, and they see which ones do well. And the ones that do badly, they don't sell. But the ones that do well, they say, hey, look, this fund of ours, this beat the market every year in the last 5 years. We haven't been selling the public yet, but now we're convinced it's good, so now you can buy. Sounds pretty good, right? I mean, if you were deciding what mutual fund to buy, you probably would look at its performance over the last 5 years and see how it did. But let me emphasize that this is the Baltimore stockbroker game under a different name, because that mutual fund probably experimented with 100 or 1,000 different funds. They're offering you the one that did the best, but just by chance, one of them was going to do pretty well. The fact that the best one did well, it gives you very little information about how, if any, about how well you can expect that fund to do in the future. Just like the person who invests with the Baltimore stockbroker, you are impressed by something because you didn't see how many chances the person gave themselves to win the game. And even one more, I don't want to make this all about finance, but let's bring it back to science, not just math, but science, because one point of this story I want to emphasize is this paper got published in statistical science, and it got published because it met the usual standards that we use for determining whether a scientific study merits publication. So maybe that should make you worry a little bit about the usual standards. that we use for deciding whether a scientific study merits publication, and that is exactly a worry that people are having, and essentially for this reason. So let me explain. Throughout the history of science, well, maybe not the whole history of science, but let's say 20th century and onwards, we have a notion of statistical significance that was developed. It's not ancient. It's from the early 20th century. It's developed by a fellow named Fisher, one of the sort of founders of modern statistics. It's actually hard to define correctly. I'm not going to try to give you a definition just with my mouth. You can sort of sit down and do homework about it, but I think it's better just to give you some sense of, it is supposed to give you some sense of how likely you would be to see the phenomenon you saw if there were no effect. Like if the drug you were trying to test did not actually work, if the social intervention you were studying actually had no effect. And if that probability is low, we say like, we gave the drug to a lot of people, a lot of them got better. We don't think that would have happened if the drug didn't work. But suppose you tried 1,000 different drugs, and on one of them, all the patients got better. Well, if you had 1,000 chances, you were probably going to win. You were going to hit the jackpot one of those times, even if none of your drugs worked, right? Maybe this didn't used to be such a big problem because scientists used to sort of more or less do one experiment at a time. But in modern science, that's just not true, right? I mean, in some sense, because we can slice and dice the data so many different ways. We do a single experiment and we can say, like, well, how do we work on this population? How do we work in that population? What if we control for this? What if we control for that? Essentially, with the same data set, you can effectively do 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 different experiments. And all of a sudden, with that much wiggle room, maybe it's not so surprising if one of those trials passed the test of statistical significance. And the crucial point is that would probably happen even if the drug you were testing or the social intervention you were probing, even if it had no effect whatsoever. Given enough chances to win the statistical significance game, you would probably win. And I think that is exactly the result of the kind of, maybe it's not too strong to say, kind of a crisis that we're seeing in empirical science right now. In social science, in medical science, in biological science, almost everywhere, where people are truly asking themselves, is the way we decided what's a positive scientific result and what's not, are those now outmoded? Given the amount of computation we can do and how quickly we can do it, do we simply have too much wiggle room?
If you do it with a placebo, would that happen? Because you have the drug plus you have the placebo. If you have both groups, would both be shown to be positive in your example?
Could be, but I mean, imagine if you had 1,000 different placebos.
What did he ask?
Please repeat the question.
Oh, so the question was, would you expect to see that both in the drug arm of the trial and the placebo arm? But if you had enough different placebos, yes, one of them you would see a strong positive effect. It would be very weird if you didn't.
Slice and dice the population on the placebos. You'll find the, quote, high responders.
Exactly. I mean, so there's lots of. So the comment was, maybe let me say a little bit more about this slicing and dicing for those who are not familiar with what kind of stuff. The idea would be, just as Rips and his collaborators had lots of options about which exact name to use for the rabbi that could affect the results, I could be looking at a big study I did with 1,000 patients and say, okay, I ran the trial, I didn't see any effect, but what if I just look at men? Or what if I just look at women? Or what if I just look at people over 25? Or what if I just look at people under 25? What if I look at just women under 25? What if I look at just men over 25? You see how I'm giving myself a lot of chances? And if I keep on doing that, the odds that one of those trials will give me a positive result is pretty high, just by chance, even if the drug has no effect whatsoever, even if it's just water or homeopathy or whatever it may be. So I hope that's a little disturbing. What can be done about it? Well, the good news is that I think that people are aware of this problem and are working to account for it. So there's a few things that people are doing. One is simply saying, well, maybe people should just have less wiggle room. So a way to do that is to say, look, if you're going to write a scientific paper, you have to submit your experimental protocol before you actually do the experiment. In other words, say, these are the subgroups of the population I'm going to study. I'm not going to run the study, see I got no results, and then slice and dice still further. I'm committing to this is what I'm going to study and nothing else. I think that is good on scientific rigor, but boy, morally it's hard, right? Work hard on something and you're like, man, I said I wasn't going to do these other tests, but I really want to. Because I'm a drug company and I put a lot of money into developing this drug. Boy, I really just want to type one more key on my spreadsheet, test one more thing. It's so I'm just saying, it puts people in a difficult position. Another way, which I think in the long run is probably better, is for us to just kind of philosophically rethink how we see the results of scientific experiments. So I think, now I'm speaking kind of as a science popularizer, somebody who writes a lot about, mostly math, but also other scientific things in the press. I think often if a paper is published that finds a positive effect for a certain intervention, whether it be a drug or a psychological phenomenon or anything else, we tend to think of that as the answer. Oh, you were wondering whether that drug works. Now we know that it does. I think that's just not what statistical significance is. I don't think it's what statistical significance ever was, and I don't think it's what the people who designed these statistical tests meant for it to be. And actually for me, studying this, writing about it in the book, it was extremely enlightening to go back to those statisticians from the 30s and 40s and read about what they thought those tests were for, because it's quite different from the way we use those tests now. So I think the way I think of it now is that we should see a positive result on these statistical tests. We should see that as the detective, not the judge. Right? It's not telling us, okay, the question is finished, if the matter is settled, this works or this doesn't work. It's a clue. It's evidence. It's telling us where to look. If we see a positive result, that's saying we should try to replicate. We should do the same kind of experiment under different circumstances and try to understand. But it's never sort of an on or off thing, right? It's just kind of moving our beliefs towards or away believing in something. Coming back to where we started, coming back to the story of the Bible codes, there's one really big difference between the Bible code story and the story of the Baltimore stockbroker. And that's that the Baltimore stockbroker is actually setting out to scam you. People often ask me when I tell this story, so what do I think was going on with Rips and his collaborators? I mean, were they trying to sort of perpetrate a scam on the scientific community in the name of promoting the divine authorship of the Torah? Of course I don't know. What do you want to ask a question?
Yes, I saw an Alfred Hitchcock video of the same story.
Yeah, so it's been on TV, right? There was a British one and there was a Hitchcock one. But I still don't know if it's ever really been carried out. But it's been depicted for sure in movies and television. Yeah. So again, if I ask myself what was in those researchers' minds, I truly don't know. But if you want my honest opinion, I don't think they were setting out to do a scam. I think probably what happened is something like this. And again, I'm just speculating, but I think probably what happened is something like this. They probably found, by chance, a very good match, like sort of one rabbi's name, which was, with that choice of name, very close to their birth date, two overlapping equidistant letter sequences in the Torah. And they probably said to themselves, well, obviously that's the right choice of name for that rabbi, because look how close it is. And then work from there. But once you do that, even once, you've put your thumb on the scale. Right? If you make your choices of which name to use based on the fact that the results look good, you're already putting your thumb on the scale and you're already sort of polluting your results. Yeah.
As a person who's done a lot of computer experiments where the work was really done by graduate students, as a person who's done a lot of computer experiments where the work was really done by graduate students, I know there's another possibility, which is they kept looking and they didn't come and tell me until they had what they thought I wanted to see.
That's called.
So that's, in this case, I don't think they have like a lab doing this. I don't think they have like a lot of subsidiary people. I think it was the three of them, but that does, but in the context of large scale biomedical and psychological and other scientific experiments, that definitely happens. And that's sort of actually exactly where I want to bring it, which is that I think in a way, the Baltimore stockbroker story is more of a scam, but I see this biocode story as more like the story that's challenging us now with science, where there really aren't bad actors per se. There really aren't people who are setting out to try to scam the public. There's people who really believe that a phenomenon is real, and it's very hard to avoid sort of setting up your experiment in order to get the answers you expect to get. That, I think, makes the story less morally problematic, but in some sense actually more challenging when we think about how to combat this problem, because you know, the hardest scam to fight is, of course, the one that you run on yourself. So I'm gonna stop there. It seems like, honestly, it seems like the question period already started, actually, unbeknownst to me, so let's continue the Q&A. I'm gonna go all the way to the back.
Wait, she's got the mic up.
Oh, I'm not? Okay, sorry. I'm gonna go wherever the mic goes.
There's one situation where that scam has been working for many years, and that is the stockbroker who can pick stocks better than an index fund. And for many, many years, the index funds kept saying they were doing better, but the stockbrokers were much more successful in selling individual stocks, and the costs were higher. And what has occurred in the last 10 years is that when the mutual funds that are invested in the indices, they 80% of the time they're beating the individually chosen ones. And now, for the very first time, more money is going into the Vanguard Fund and another fund called Dimensional Fund Advisors, both of which are index-based funds, and that money is coming out of the other kinds of funds. And that whole business is totally changed in the last few years.
Yeah, and this is actually, I mean, I have been in many vehement arguments about this exact subject, mostly between myself and my dad, but also other people. Yeah, so I mean, this is a fascinating question because there is this entire industry of people who pick stocks, and nobody really knows whether there is such a thing as being good at picking stocks. But I mean, there are definitely super smart people who will tell you, no, definitely there's a skill, and other super smart people who will tell you there's no evidence of that. I come down more on the latter side, and I'm a Vanguard guy myself, but I recognize there's interesting arguments on both sides. For this, I like, it's an old chestnut, but it's a classic. Burton Malkiel's book, A Random Walk Down Wall Street. I think that's still relevant, even though it's a 30-year-old book. Is that what you were going to bring up?
Updated it. Vogel is, for 40, 50 years has said that. What he says is that you can have a streak, but after him.
Oh, you need the mic actually, right? All right. Well, let's do this question then.
So, thank you for putting out publications that make math for the masses. Because your publications have been very interesting in terms of how we look at the use of math in everyday life. As for the newsletter, that's the guy who made the money selling newsletters. Anyways, I understand that you're now a star of stage and screen and a consultant to the movie industry. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Oh, sure. This goes in a different direction, right? Our sort of American secular religion, Hollywood, instead of our shared religion of Judaism. Here, no, it was an interesting story. There's a movie that just came out called Gifted, which is the story of a sort of young girl who's a big math prodigy. I got involved in that movie for a couple of reasons. Like one, because I'd written about kind of the life of a child math prodigy, so I spoke with the director and producer just about, the director was trying to do his homework and sort of get some sense of like what the life would be like of the character he was directing. The director, it turns out, is actually from Madison, who grew up about a half mile from my house down on Monroe Street. So Mark Webb, I don't know if you guys know this, big time Hollywood director. He's a Madison guy. His father is a professor in math education here. Yeah, so I ended up going down and being on set for the movie. I was there for this sort of big blackboard scene, and then they put me in at the very end. There's actually about maybe 2.5 seconds on screen playing a math professor. So it was a very big, a very big stretch. I was just on a plane last week, and like half the people on the plane were like watching on their seat back. So of course I like told everybody, like, wait a minute, I'm in this wait, watch till the end, don't turn it off. But yeah, I think it's an interesting moment where I think, on the one hand, there's tons of entertainment, there's tons of data journalism, and in some sense, math is much more in the public eye than ever before. At the same time, I think we're also in a moment of sort of extreme skepticism towards science, towards academia. So I mean, I think those two tendencies kind of overlay each other and to some extent kind of contradict each other, and it creates like a really interesting tension. I don't know where it's going to go. I know which side I'm on. Okay, so who's holding the mic now? I lost it. Where it is.
Going back for a second about index funds versus money managers.
Yeah.
What Bogle said, and he was the one who founded and started all of this, he said that you could have a money manager who could have a string of 5, 6, Lynch being one of the guys, for a decade, 2 decades. The point was that the vast majority can't do it. Number 2, it's not predictable. Where index funds did meet the requirements of consistency and the returns were better because of low fees, etc. With regard to research now, going back to the science point, even when one develops an antibiotic, one has to remember that what the drug companies do, say, etc., isn't exactly always science. Even when you develop an antibiotic for a disease, if one is ethically honest, you'll say that there is a high probability that this will be an efficacious treatment for a particular disease. Saying that means that it isn't 100% curable, but there is statistical data that will show X, Y, and Z. When I mentioned the placebo before, what I was referring to is if you took a particular drug and you took a placebo matching that particular entity, and then you did 1,000 studies, I was asking, yes, that one drug, XYZ, will show a positive effect, where the other 999 won't. But what I would argue is that placebo will show a certain percentage, 30% or so, that it was like that drug. But because it doesn't show the other 70%, it is then shown that the efficacy is true and more than by chance. Otherwise, all is lost. I mean, one could say it's by chance. That's all I meant to imply.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that again, there's a lot of views about like what's going on with the current modes of biomedical research, and I am not kind of in the sort of strong doomsayer camp that says that like everything that's coming out is garbage and we don't know anything. I don't think that's true at all. I just think we have to be better about realistically interpreting the information that we're getting, but I think there is a lot of signal in the noise. I think we are. I mean, drug companies actually make lots of good drugs that work. I don't think that can be denied.
Yeah, I believe I heard you say, and this is what I wrote down, and I may have got it wrong. You made a sentence that said, we should avoid on-off decisions. Like it's the drug is okay. Now, the context, I believe, in which you said it, I may have it wrong, was that you were trying to speak to the scientists and the mathematicians and the statisticians. I think that was the context in which you were directing that statement to how there should be standards for publishing scientific studies. I thought that was the context. All right. Separate from that, there is the world of the social science world, including such things as the domain of law. And when you look at environmental laws, the environmental laws are not asking for statistical analysis. The message is, we want an on-off decision. We want to be able to say that the air shall have a certain concentration of bad chemicals, and it's okay, it's safe if it's below that, but if it's above that, it's not safe. All right, that's a different domain than the scientific domain. How do you bring that message, avoiding an on-off decision, into this other domain that is not scientific and technical?
Okay, I couldn't answer this question by like reading out loud like an entire like 40-page chapter of my book, which I wrote when I was like trying to understand exactly this question. I won't, but let me summarize, because I think the point you make is extremely important, and it's one that, to be honest, when I started writing, I hadn't really grasped. Like, it was by going back and reading what people wrote that I understood this kind of philosophical question, which is that there's two things that we're doing when we do science, and those two things are completely separate. One is we are trying to form beliefs. We're trying to change our mental state about what we think is true and what we think is not true. The other thing we're trying to do, standing over here, is make decisions about what to do and what not to do. And those processes are related, but they're not the same thing. And I think your bringing up of the law is a perfect example, because of course, in criminal law, there's like two things going on, right? New evidence kind of makes you feel like a little more like somebody did the crime or a little less like somebody did the crime. But in the end, there's no such thing as sort of guilty, right? In the end, like a court does not have the option of sort of making a decision part way between on and off. The court is going to convict somebody or not. And that doesn't, but I mean, so this is what's fascinating is when you go back in the history of the development of statistical significance, they were very explicit in saying this is not a tool for telling you what to believe or how to think. It's a tool for telling you what to publish or not to publish, or what drug to approve or what drug not to approve. In other words, it's a tool to be used in those contexts where you have no choice but to make a yes or no decision, which are quite common. And I think what I want to promote is this idea that even though we often have to make yes or no decisions, we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that those reflect on or off correct beliefs about the state of the world. We should still sort of be unsure about what's true, even as we make a decision that sort of looks like we're sure. Because sometimes we have no choice but to make a decision like that. I hope I'm speaking to what you're speaking to.
Yeah, you're certainly addressing it, but how to handle your answer in practice, to me, is the difference.
Well, look, for environmental laws, I actually think it's a super, super interesting case, because there, you could imagine a regime, and lots of people push exactly this, where instead of saying, okay, there's like a threshold, this many parts per million of this pollutant in the atmosphere, anything above it is like terrible and has to be outlawed. Anything below it is like great, and everybody, I mean, that doesn't reflect the reality, but I mean, plenty of people are like, well, we should have like a carbon tax or like general pollutant tax, where there's sort of some continuous function where, you know, you pay by some function of how much pollutants you belch forth into the atmosphere, right? And that's, I mean, I actually feel like, just to get on my hobby horse, I feel like our legal system hates continuous functions. And I think it would be better if there was more continuous functions. I think it would be better. I mean, look, we're seeing this right now with the discussion about Medicaid thresholds, where a lot of pain is caused by the fact that you're like, if you make $1 less than this threshold, you get all these benefits, and if you make $1 more, you get nothing. Why do we have so many cliffs? It's because people are afraid of continuous functions. I mean, we have very good calculators. People should be able to handle a more graduated thing. So I think maybe a way to say it is that there are some situations, like locking somebody up in jail or not, where we have no choice but to make a binary on-off decision. But I think we probably make too many of them, and I think we probably structure too many things that way that we don't have to.
My question is about statistical significance.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, I'm making this up, but let's say 3 out of 100 people have high cholesterol and there would be some kind of heart event. So 3 out of 100.
Mm-hmm. And
if you take this drug, it reduces it by 2/3. So wow, that's significant. So now it's 1 out of 100. To my mind, 3 out of 100, 1 out of 100, that's pretty close. But the headlines would be, if you take this drug, it reduces the significance by 2/3. So that's statistically significant, but in the real world, is that even a meaningful number.
Yes, this is one of those things where the word significance is, in retrospect, probably the wrong English word to have assigned to this mathematical concept. It's kind of too late to change it now, but I mean, the point you make is a very good one, that what we call statistical significance, it would probably be better called something like statistical detectability or statistical noticeableness. Is that a word? Because it certainly doesn't mean meaningfulness, right? It's sort of a very small effect, which has no practical meaning, can be statistically significant in the sense that you can detect it if you have like a big enough sample of people. But as you say, it doesn't mean significant in this sort of usual English language sense of this is something you should care about. As you say, there's like lots of issues where you can reduce the risk of, if somehow you reduced the risk of being eaten by a bear by half. Not that many people are eaten by bears, so really like the number of people who would not end up inside a bear who otherwise would have is like not that great, to be honest. Yeah. Okay, I'm not in control of the mic though, right? Or where is it?
Okay.
Oh, there it is, okay.
Okay, I'm not a mathematician. I'm wretched at math.
Oh, don't say that. You're killing me here. Okay, we'll talk about that. But as your question, then we'll come back. Put a pin in
I'm going
it.
to have to figure out the statistics on this thing that I have observed. I read a book which was for our book club thing here, and it was about a mother that solved a math problem, a specific math problem. I went to the movies last week and I saw a child that was solving the same specific math problem. In addition to that, the setting for the book was right here in Madison, right by the zoo, right by Monroe Street. And then I hear that the director of the movie was from Monroe Street as well, and he wasn't the author of the book. And it's like different things are piling up in my mind that say, could this be some kind of plagiarism? What's going on here?
Right, so see, you're doing like the Bible codes analysis, like on the. So in this case, okay, so I'm not sure what movie you saw. It might have been the movie I was in, actually. It was like, yeah, so I know enough about both. Okay, I don't know how to pronounce Stu's last name. Could somebody yell it out?
Royce Thatcher.
Okay, I don't know enough about Stu Royce. I know enough about Stu Royce Thatcher's book and enough about that movie to feel 100% confident that those stories were developed independently. And indeed, I mean, it's kind of a compelling story that people like. I mean, you could say, of course, the play Proof, which won the Pulitzer Prize about 15 years ago, is also a movie about a kind of mom who like solves an ancient math conundrum, and that story, it's like Oedipus or something, right? We're like drawn to it, and we keep on coming back to it and like retelling it many different ways. So I think the reason that you see that story repeating itself again and again is just because it's an awesome story. Simple as that.
To your point about the terminology we use, I've noticed in the medical literature the last few years, the terminology instead of p-test, p-value or chi-square test or whatever is hardly ever being used anymore. But people refer to a test of non-inferiority.
Oh, I'm actually not familiar with that.
It comes up again and again now in the medical literature.
But is it the same mathematical test rebranded, or is it just a test that I don't know?
I don't know what it is.
Okay. A test of non-inferiority. All right. It has a ring to it. I like it.
Well, in terms of the Bible codes, they clearly were, wrong. But what if God's language really is mathematics? Is that possible? In what sense is that possible? Is there, if you really look at physics and you dig, are you actually looking at mathematics?
Well, I think you know, I think God is God and physics is the devil, so I think those two questions are opposite of each other. No, but I think that is a really interesting question, and I think it speaks to, you know, I think for those of us who are mathematicians, we certainly see the study of mathematical entities as part of the study of the world we live in. We don't see them as, we sort of see it as like part of looking at creation. Like I think in some sense, to the outside world, I think we are often seen as doing something that's completely separate from the world and not part of it. I think mathematical objects are as real as like mountains or frogs or like other things. So I do, and let me say this, I would say that just as in Maimonides' story, Abraham kind of looks at the physical world and sort of says like, well, how could these spheres have gotten to moving the way they do without sort of somebody to push them, which is like a very classical thing that you see throughout Christian apologetics too, and like throughout basically, and I'm sure if I knew anything about Islam or Buddhism or other world religions, I'm sure they have, I don't know, do you know, Jordan? I mean, is there this tradition of saying like a prime mover, like they're sort of reasoning that there must be some force. I'm sure that exists in every religious tradition, right?
Yeah, for example, in Islam, you'll get that through studying Greek philosophy, which in Middle Ages Islam got very into.
Aha, okay, so, but I think actually in mathematical circles, you know, there's this famous, you know, there's a guy called Paul Erdős, who was a very famous mathematician in the first part of the 20th century. He liked to talk about the book, you know, God's book, where like the sort of, that's really the correct proof of everything is. And I do think that in the mathematical world, there's some sense, do you ask if like math could be God's language? I think the mathematician's version of this kind of prime mover philosophy is when you spend a lot of time thinking about mathematics, and you sort of spend like, and our world is very slow, right? We sort of spend like years thinking about one thing. You do kind of get the feeling, well, somebody must understand this. You know what I mean? Like, I have no clue, but just the same way that Abraham is like, somebody must have said those spheres moving. I'm like, somebody must know whether this equation has solutions or not, because either it does or it doesn't, and I sure don't know. So I think that's in some sense that's sort of our version of that story.
Yeah. Back to the question of research. It seems like the whole model needs a big revamp. If you have 20 different people do the same study, and only the one that finds statistical significance gets to publish it, and nobody else gets to publish it, then obviously you're going to just there's no journal of irreconcilable differences with that, and so on, irreproducible results, right? And shouldn't there be, in this day and age, an ability for everyone who runs a study to somehow publish their results?
Yeah, we're definitely moving towards that. I think the culture is shifting in that direction because, first of all, our scientific publishing culture comes from a day in which you had to put things on paper and mail them places, which was expensive. We still somehow have like publication bottlenecks, which are inherited from that era, but there's no reason, right? I mean, there's nothing, I mean, so I think people are moving more towards, yes, we should publish negative results and say those other 19 labs that tried the same thing and found nothing. Those results should be like available to the public in like a finished form. And even more than that, you know, I said like people should like commit to their protocols and be like, okay, I'm not going to test anything I didn't say I was going to test. I think there's a movement towards saying not only that, but the journal should commit to, we're going to publish your paper because we think it's a good experiment, whether the results are positive or not. I think there's no reason for that not to be the culture of science, and I do think that's the way things are moving. So I'm not sure we're totally there yet, but I think that's where we'll be.
I wanted to, it seems to me that the people who work at the FDA are quite aware of the problem that you described, and I think that they get around it by forcing people to focus on a particular question rather than pick and choose the question that they want to ask. So that's my first point. My second point is in the events that you were talking about. The guy predicted all the events, but he didn't. There were a lot of events that he didn't try to predict, so he picked the events that he could predict. And so I think that's
or he did try and failed and didn't mention it. That's also very funny.
So that's the second point. The third point is another illustration. You know, people who read their
Horoscopes?
Fortune tellers. They read their things, and the fortune teller says, "Gee, my results are great. All the people who come back to me say that that worked, but the problem is the people who didn't work didn't come back to us. So those are my 3 points.
So with that, let me just say, and I should have started with it. My acquaintance with statistics largely comes from the fact that my parents are both statisticians, and in fact, my mom worked at the FDA for decades, and so I'm very familiar with the stuff that they do. And I should say that this stuff that I'm talking about, the sort of challenges we have with the results of experiments, it's not a secret. It wasn't just discovered like 5 years ago. And the people at the FDA, of course, have known about these issues. But maybe I'll just say one more thing about the FDA, about my mom's own experience. Just to sort of speak against myself, I said, wouldn't it be great if we just sort of said, this is the protocol, we're not going to peek at the data as we go and change things, we're going to now that's a great thing to say, but here's one thing that happens if you're at the FDA and you're running a large-scale clinical trial. Let's say there's 20 labs and they're like, okay, this is the protocol, we're not going to start looking at the data until everything's finished, we're committing to that, and they start giving people the drug, and the doctors are calling in and saying people are dropping dead, right and left. Then what do you do?
There's by ethics, they can't just do these studies. They have to go through ethical boards also.
Right.
And the ethical boards say 2 things. If there's a terrible outcome, you break the code, you look. If there's an incredibly good outcome, where doctors call this is the best thing since sliced bread, they're also allowed to break the code.
Exactly, but this is a delicate thing, and this is exactly where my mom worked. It's at the intersection of statistics and ethics, and the problems are very difficult because, somebody has to make that call of when are the outcomes we're seeing without analyzing the data, when do they look so bad on their surface that we better smash the glass box, break in case of emergency. That's a hard question, and you kind of need to have both ethicists and statisticians and doctors in the room. So that's one of the things my mom was involved in. So in other words, I definitely don't want to make it sound like these questions have easy answers. There's a reason that they're hard, and any kind of easy protocol you make up, there's going to be cases that challenge it in a very serious way, like that.
Let's go back to the lady that brought up the case of 3 people with high cholesterol.
Yep.
The conclusion here seemed to be that there were 98 people who were disappointed as a result of the study. What about the 3 people that had high cholesterol? 2/3 of them were better. Pragmatically, I think the important people were the 3 people, not the 100 people, or not the 98 people who were not.
You're one of those 3%ers.
In my subject, we were talking about stock market pickers and index companies. Now, it used to be that 76% of the stock market pickers, 76% of mutual funds didn't do as well as the index funds. I prefer to look at the fact that 24% were doing better than the index pickers. It just so happens that statistically, the pendulum has swung towards the index funds. So today, only about 12% are doing better than the market.
24% don't repeat. That's your problem.
There you go.
Right.
If you look at the statistics, which are printed quarterly in Barron's, they show 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year, and 15-year results for mutual funds. There are about 8,000 mutual funds. If you say only 12% are doing better, on a 15-year basis, on a 10-year basis, on a 5-year basis, there's going to be pickers that are doing consistently better than the indexes. And I believe, go to those people.
So, as I said, this is like a hot argument that shows no signs of cooling off, and there's definitely, and there's people on both sides of it, and there's a lot of really interesting data on both sides. Maybe what I would compare it to is something else I read about in the book. And I'm just thinking because I actually have to go give a talk at a mutual fund next week that I haven't written yet, and I have to make some slides about this, so it's sort of on my mind. But I would compare it with the question of the hot hand in basketball. I don't know, how many of you guys watch basketball ever? So there's this question of, is there such a thing as somebody just being hot? They just can't miss. They make every shot that they take. Now, of course, we know, if you look, of course, you can go find times where people make 10 shots in a row. The question is that by chance, or are those people in a zone where they've truly improved their shot making ability for a short amount of time? And this has been a hot topic for decades, very many arguments on both sides. Actually, there's like a lot of even recent work on this that's kind of has moved people back and forth on it. But what I would say is, again, there's two questions that are worth separating. Just as with your question, you can separate the question of what to believe versus what to do. Because then one question is it the case that basketball players can temporarily be like super hot? And that's a similar question structurally to, can a stock picker sort of, have they identified some inefficiency in the market and like really be doing much better than the market? So the one question is, does that exist? But the other question, which is actually more important practically, is, can you tell who those people are from the outside? Because if you can't, then it doesn't actually matter in terms of your investment. So in other words, I think there's one point of view which kind of splits the difference. I'm not really necessarily endorsing this, but it's an interesting point of view. It says that, yes, there are people who are authentically better at picking stocks than the index, but nobody, including them, knows who they are. So if there's no way to figure out which people those are, it sort of doesn't matter whether those people are authentically good at it. And I certainly think the data shows that picking people who have done well over the past 10 years is not an effective way of locating people who will do well over the next 5 years. I think every piece of data shows that, and the argument is like, well, what does that mean? I mean, that's certainly what Malkiel says, and that's, I haven't seen compelling arguments against that. There's like very little correlation between who did well over the last 10 years and who does well over the next 5 years, or something like this.
Years ago, I saw a television program about a monk named Nicodemus, and they showed how he made predictions by the repetitive of certain Hebrew letters, and how these predictions came true. You want to comment on Nicodemus?
How did he beat the index funds over the last 5 years?
He predicted wars, he predicted the fall of empires, etc., etc., etc.
Nostradamus.
Nostradamus?
Oh, I thought it was his smarter little brother, Nicodemus. All I can say is that I'm going to say the same thing. Like, there's probably 1,000 monks who were like sitting there, like making these predictions, and we remember the one who got a few things right. But it doesn't mean that there's. What else do they have to do? They're sitting there alone in their monastery, like they can't talk. Like they're just. So I think you're seeing the same phenomenon of wiggle room, and we remember the name of the person who got a few hits. But that's my view. That's my view. Yeah.
Yes, I have one question. We're talking about sports and basketball.
All right. Okay.
Okay. At the last 2 seconds in the game, the commentators say, "Well, they got to go to so and so because he's been hot," and the coach goes to that person. Everybody's looking at him. What are the odds of something like that when they keep going back to the man who's been hot on that field?
I think this is exactly the issue where I don't want to say something I'm not expert in, but I think if you merely say you should go to that player because they hit their last 5 shots, that's probably not a very reliable way of knowing who's likely to make the next shot. That being said, I think an actual coach in real life is going on much more information than that, right? They're not just like looking at, did they hit their last few shots? They're like literally talking to the player and seeing if the player feels like they're hot, which is not something you can observe from the outside. And so I would not like having to give away my math card by saying this, but I tend to put a lot of faith that like a basketball coach that's been working with a team for an entire year kind of has pretty good ideas about who to give the ball to, and I tend to defer to their judgment.
He's perpetually doing this, always finishing up well, not only this game.
You're saying the same player is like hot at the end of every game?
No, but I think a lot of times they do think this guy has done it all season, he's going to pull it through. We've seen it in Wisconsin.
I think the example, so I know more about this issue in baseball than in basketball, where the question of whether there's such a thing as a clutch hitter is another sort of one of these, you know, are there players who just become better under in a high pressure, high leverage situation? I think that is still pretty controversial, and I think people really don't know whether there's such a thing. Whenever somebody talks about a player like that, I'm always like, why don't they criticize that guy for slacking off like in the other games? I mean, they count too. If they're able to hit that well, why don't they just hit that well all the time?
When the coach adopts the play, he also has to consider the alternative, whether they're going to get the ball into him. So he's got to have an alternate high hand, which may be a cold hand, which may win the game.
I mean, it's a fascinating question. Basketball is much more complicated than baseball from this point of view. I mean, and one thing when they try to study it, just to give some indication of how difficult it is to study these problems quantitatively, they say like, well, if somebody's hot, can we see will they continue to be hot? Will they make the next shot? Well, let's remember that there's another team on the court. So if somebody's like very hot, they may get covered like more aggressively, right? They may actually not be able to get as open of a shot. So maybe that their ability is just as elevated, but the other team is simply not allowing them to like get close to the basket.
Okay, a question about the Torah.
Yes.
Suppose a rabbi comes over here. He changes his name at Ellis Island, and the date of his birth is confused now. F.H., which do you look?
Yeah, this is, I mean, again, like, what do you do if you do this whole trial and then you find out you were wrong about one of the dates? Or, I mean, and again,
change your birthday.
And again, this is something that Jordan knows more about me, that there is some, I mean, there is some controversy about the exact letter sequence of the Torah, right? There are sort of some places where, you know, if you have a disagreement about like one letter's placement, all of a sudden all the sequences like get messed up. So like, you know, I mean, so yes, I think, and all of these techniques are not very robust to sort of small errors like that.
Getting back to the stock picking, you can drive by, let's say, Cracker Barrel, and you see the parking lots stacked up. There's no room to park, no matter what the time of day is. So you say, this company must be doing well. You buy the stock, and the stock goes up. Then we turn to Under Armour, and you start watching football games, and you see more teams have the Under Armour logo. So, and then you hear that Under Armour is throwing all this cash at the University of Wisconsin to put their logo in, and at other schools. And so you buy that stock. That stock, and this is a true story, that stock goes up over to 100, about 120. All of a sudden, Under Armour's earnings come in. Today, Under Armour stock is selling for 18 because of the fact they threw all the money at the schools to use their logo and so forth, and that caused their earnings to go in dirt. The hell.
Well, first of all I can say is if you have an 11-year-old son like I do, you just feel like putting all of your life savings into Under Armour. I mean, you can't even believe, like, Nike stinks, Adidas is stupid, like, everything is terrible except Under Armour. Like, I can tell you, if you want the view from 5th grade, that's how it is. That's how it is right now. I think we've been in the Under Armour store, and it's like more than we've been in the museum. I think, like, that's it.
So, but go more and make the stock go up.
But yeah, I mean, this is, you know, another thing, by the way, I mean, this is another thing I write about in the book, is that we often see these financial transactions in terms of pure dollars, like what maximizes the expected number of dollars. And in some sense, if you're the person managing my UW pension fund, I definitely want you to do that. Definitely, yes, maximize the expected dollars. But for an individual investor, you know, there's an emotional cost too. So I think one reason people like the index funds is because you set it and forget it, and you're not kind of like riding this roller coaster all the time of like making a big bet and wondering how it's going to play out. Now, people have different temperaments, and some people like that feeling of, I'm going to put all my chips on red and see what happens. And I think a proper accounting of like what financial decisions people should make has to take into account, like, do you find it exciting or traumatizing to have like a high variance strategy where you may go up and down very fast, which for better or for worse in big index funds is unlikely to happen.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
Well, this won't be as much fun. I want to go back to this question of the 19 medical papers that didn't show any effect. I'm one of the people who agrees that, yes, indeed, we need to publish them. But I also know that when papers get published, there are a couple other guys whose names you never hear who had to review them. And so now we're going to have to be reviewing 20 times as many papers. What do you think about that?
So that is right. So we no longer have the bottleneck of printing out things on paper and mailing them to different departments, but you're absolutely right. That sort of, it's called, I think, Bowell's disease in economics, right? If there are things which require human input, we don't necessarily know how to. So, I mean, one answer would be that, well, somebody has to do them, I think, is the point that the gentleman is making. I think one thing we could do is have a level that is sort of maybe less intensive than the current publication, where it's quite simply, you register that you're going to do a certain experiment, and then without any human review, you register the data, and that data is just made public. So there's no human being sort of being like, is this important? Like, did they correctly cite all the other people who worked on this? It would be like but you're right, that there's a trade-off. If you want more of something, you kind of have to develop a less human labor-intensive version of it, or it doesn't scale. So, and then at least the data would be available to people, right? Sort of someone who wanted to do the meta-analysis would have it. And I think that would be a positive. All right, thank you.
The SEC has a law that when you publish like 5, 10, 15-year results, you must say that past results do not predict future results. That's the law. By the way, leaving on a biblical point, it's always been my opinion, biblically, that in the beginning God created mathematicians, then physicists, and the rest of humanity. You are superb.
Oh, thank you. Wait, let me learn your name because you have your things turned around the wrong way.
Sorry.
Oh, awesome.
Bachelor's, Master's in Math.
Oh, fantastic. It's great to meet you.
All I'm saying is they probably are pretty strict about forcing people not to have
Yes, that's right. I mean, but we don't know. I think it's very interesting to see the current regulatory environment is going to be very different, and I think there is. But it's related, right? I mean, I think there certainly is. Big bureaucratic changes are very hard to make, but there's certainly people in the current administration whose view is the FDA should only test safety, not efficacy. And that the idea is we'll just throw drugs out of the market, and if they, the market will determine whether or not they.
The other point, so most of the time, it's pretty what the FDA is doing. It's true. In other words, basically it's correct. But the second point I want to make is baseball.
Yeah.
Baseball is a statistician. There's all kinds of statistics. How would it hit with men on base and things like that. So the idea is clutch hitter is verifiable. You're not playing, so you absolutely know what a clutch hitter is.
Well, it's in principle verifiable, but so far I think it's not been convincingly verified. I
think it could go back. I know the old Yankee guy named Tom Lennon, and I bet you can go back with his statistics, how he hit men on base, what scoring position, you find that it's much higher than the average baseball player, and that's...
Right, but with 10,000 baseball players in history, somebody's going to be that far above average. That's exactly the question.
260, the average batting average is 260.
I think it's hard. I would, if you like this kind of stuff, there's an amazing tool called the Baseball Reference Play Index. It costs $24 a year. It's unbelievable what kind of slicing and dicing you can do with it. If you want to know who hit the most triples at home in the season among third basemen or something like that, you can do anything. Me and Caleb could play with all
suppose during his career, he
is called protection. Then the next year, in other words,
Yes, that's what you would test. And I think so. And I think in general, people have not found that people have thought of a practitioner after that determination.
In other words, you can actually see why it's true. The ability to foul off bad